All right, William Hamilton asked me to come and talk to you about some issues regarding economics. I will tell you right now, I'm not an economist, don't profess to be one, and I appreciate your acting like icicles by coming out here today. If I had my druthers, I'd probably be in a deer stand. 3 points I'd like to try to cover, and I'm going to bore you a lot with a lot of reading, mainly because I want to be more concise and precise. But let me try to break down the discussion into 3 areas. William wanted me to talk about the book called The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, which I have with me and will refer to. He also wanted to talk about the Wall Street meltdown. And I suggest that we talk about what should we do now, or what could help bring us back into some sort of economic reality. Those are the things I'm going to try to cover. Before I go any further, let me give you a list, if you're interested, of the books that I'm referring to, as well as something that my friend Linda Kettner told me that's a CD entitled The Inside Job. It's narrated by Matt Damon. Apparently that CD is available at the library or at Barnes & Noble. And that is a video that gives you a pretty good breakdown of where we are, how we got here, and I don't know if it has any solutions because I haven't seen it. Some of the books and articles that I will suggest to you: Class Warfare in America, which was actually written in 2000 by Charles M. Kelly. The Shock Doctrine, which was written in 2007 by Naomi Klein. Aftershock, written in 2010 by Robert Reich. The Age of Turbulence, written in 2007 by Alan Greenspan. The Snowball, which is the biography of Warren Buffett, written in 2009 by Alice Schroeder. The Betrayal of American Prosperity, written in 2010 by Clyde Prestowitz. The Inheritance, which is what Obama inherited, but quite frankly, it's much more about foreign relations than it is about economics, written in 2009 by David Sanger. Making Government Work, believe it or not, written by Fritz Hollings in 2010, is a pretty good primer also. Washington Rules, 2010 by Andrew Basevich, which talks about the military-industrial complex, how it utilizes your tax dollars, how it influences elections and politics. The Big Short, 2010 by Michael Lewis. Family of Secrets, 2011 by Russ Baker. This is the Bush family dynasty and how the interactions between the Bushes over time, the CIA, the Saudi family, and the oil conglomerates. And basically, it's an interesting, maybe even a conspiracy theory, but the bottom line is it gives you some background of how it could work if, in fact, it actually happened that way. I'll give you a couple of articles. I've got them. There's an article written in the Charlotte paper some time ago within the last 2 weeks by Kelly, Companies that Outsource Not Hurting Just Skilled Workers. Another article, How the Christian Fundamentalists Helped Empower the Top 1%. I think that was in, that might have been online, I think. Krugman in the News and Courier recently, GOP Lost in Economic Fantasyland. Thomas Friedman, not related to Milton Friedman. Conscientious Protests, Inevitable Change, which was the Wednesday, October 12th News and Courier. That's some background stuff if you're interested in looking at it. What I'd like to do at this point in time is go into some of what the Shock Doctrine stands for, and I will wind up reading a pretty good bit of it, and I apologize for doing so. But before I do that, let me give you 2 things that I think are important, sort of as a background and a setup for where we are, what happened, and why we haven't done anything about it. I'm going to posit to you that this country is very, very pathetic politically with regard to historical events and utilizing the history to predict and deal with present problems. For instance, the Great Depression. We had Black Monday on October the 19th, 1987, when the market dropped by 20% in one day. The savings and loan bubble burst, and the Resolution Trust to address bad mortgages, which occurred probably in the late 80s. The Enron, the conspiracy between Arthur Andersen and Enron to defraud investors with value interrelated partnerships. It was a bookkeeping thing in which they defrauded investors by keeping them jacked up about how great the stock was, energy stock. Our present problem is blatantly obvious, and I'll talk about that later. Some of you may remember Ivan Boesky, insider trader. Some of you may remember Michael Milliken, the junk bond king. More recently, you may recall a fellow by the name of Bernie Madoff, pyramid king. And we have our own local pyramid king, Al Parrish, just recently. So those are some things you may want to think about as far as the inability of our leaders and our other folks to pay attention to historical precedent and not utilize history to prevent present problems. Let me posit to you a theory that deals with an economic circle. And when you think about it, this is capitalism. You have people that make goods, whether it's a house or whether it's a toothbrush, they're making goods. In order to make those goods, they have to hire people. They pay those people wages. Those people buy the products. The circle's complete. If nobody's buying the products in our consumer society, then nobody's making anything. If nobody's making anything, nobody's hiring anybody, and therefore nobody can buy the products. When the consumer economy is going great and things are turning out and people are being paid and stuff is being bought, the consumer economy works real well. Capitalistic system, not a problem. What happens when the reverse starts happening? Where does the money go when the stock prices go down? If you bought a stock for $100 a share and that stock dropped to $50 a share and you sold that stock, where'd the money go? It's phantom. It's phantom money. No. In the real world, as opposed to fantasy land, prices of stock are supposed to be the value of a company. Not necessarily so in the real world. Henry Ford said a long time ago that I want to pay my employees enough so they can buy my product. That's the way capitalistic systems work with regard to wages. Today, we have loss of jobs, which equates to loss of income, which equates to loss of consumer products, which creates to loss of production, which equals less jobs. If no work, then less taxes to government, less services by government, more money out in unemployment compensation, and reduction in state, local, federal employees, which compounds that problem. Have you ever heard of something by an insurance advertiser that says, personal responsibility is our policy? Isn't it interesting that the company that states that is a corporation, and the whole purpose of a corporation is to avoid personal responsibility? Ladies and gentlemen, I've given you my general outline and BS. Now, let's talk about, well, Alan Greenspan talks about a theory called creative destruction. That theory is that a market economy, while necessarily revitalizes itself from within, by scrapping old and failing businesses and then reallocating resources to newer, more productive ones. And that was actually a theory by a fellow by the name of, an economist by the name of J. Schumpeter in 1942. As usual, in academic theories, especially economic academic theories, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't in the real world. And remember always that academic theories are basically explanations of real world at that time. They are not necessarily applicable forever and ever. They change. Remember some cute things in the old days. How about Reagan's trickle-down theory? How about voodoo economics? Even Greenspan said that Reagan increased the national debt by $2 trillion, and he did. All right, I've talked a little bit. Unfortunately, now you get to listen to me read. Let me read the short stuff first, which might be beneficial to you. No, let me not do that. Doesn't make as much sense otherwise. In the shock doctrine, if you read nothing more than the introduction, you will get pretty much the theory. The balance of the book bases and backs it up with historical precedent in different countries and how it's been applied. The news racing around the shelter that day was that Richard Baker, a prominent Republican congressman from New Orleans, had told a group of lobbyists, "We finally cleaned up public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did it." Joseph Canizero, one of New Orleans' wealthiest developers, had just expressed a similar statement. "I think we have a clean sheet to start again. And with that clean sheet, we have some big opportunities." All that week, the Louisiana state governor, legislature in Baton Rouge had been crawling with corporate lobbyists, helping to lock in those big opportunities. Lower taxes, fewer regulation, cheaper workers, smaller, safer city, which in practice meant plans to level the public housing project and replace them with condos. Hearing all the talk of fresh starts and clean sheets, you could almost forget how the toxic stew of rubble, chemical outflows, and human remains just a few miles down the highway. Over at the shelter, Jamar could think of nothing else. I really don't see it as cleaning up the city. What I see is a lot of people got killed uptown, people who shouldn't have died. He was speaking quietly, but an older man in line in front of us overheard and whipped around. "What's wrong with these people in Baton Rouge? This isn't an opportunity, it's a goddamn tragedy. Are they blind?" A mother with 2 kids chimed in. "No, they're not blind. They're evil. They see just fine." One of those who saw opportunity in the floodwaters of New Orleans was Milton Friedman, grand guru of the movement for unfettered capitalism and the man credited with writing the rule book for the contemporary hypermobile global economy. 93 years old and failing health, Uncle Milty, as he was known to his followers, nonetheless found the strength to write an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal 3 months after the New Orleans levees broke. "Most New Orleans schools are in ruins," Freeman observed, "as are the homes of the children who attended them. The children are scattered all over the country. This is a tragedy. It's also an opportunity to radically reform the educational system." Freeman's radical idea was that instead of spending a portion of the billions of dollars in reconstruction money on rebuilding and improving New Orleans' existing public school system, the government should provide families with vouchers, which they could spend at private institutions, many run at a profit, that would be subsidized by the state. It was critical, Freeman wrote, that these fundamental changes not be stopgap but rather permanent. A network of right-wing think tanks seized on Freeman's proposal and descended on the city after the storm. The administration of George Bush backed up their plans with tens of millions of dollars to convert New Orleans schools to charter schools, publicly funded institutions run by private entities according to their rules. Charter schools are deeply polarized in the United States and nowhere more so than New Orleans. where they are seen by many African-American parents as a way of reversing gains of the civil rights movements, which guaranteed all children the same standard of education. For Freeman, however, the entire concept of the state-run school system reeked of socialism. In his view, the state's sole functions were to protect our freedoms both from enemies outside our gates and from fellow citizens, to preserve law and order, to enforce private contracts, to foster competitive markets. In other words, to supply the police and the soldiers. Anything else, including providing free education, was an unfair interference with the market system. In sharp contrast to the glacial pace with which the levees were repaired and the electricity grid was brought back online, the auctioning off of New Orleans' school system took place with military speed and precision. Within 19 months, most of the city's poor residents still in exile, New Orleans' public school system had been almost completely replaced by privately run charter schools. Before Hurricane Katrina, the school board had run 123 public schools. Now it ran 4. Before that storm, there had been 7 charter schools in the city. Now there were 31. New Orleans teachers used to be represented by a strong union. Now the union's contract had been shredded, and its 4,700 members had all been fired. Some of the younger teachers were rehired by the charters at reduced salaries. Most were not. New Orleans was now, according to the New York Times, the nation's preeminent laboratory for the widespread use of charter schools, while the American Enterprise Institute, a Freemanite think tank, enthused that Katrina accomplished in a day what Louisiana school reformers couldn't do in years of trying. Public school teachers, meanwhile, watched money allocated for the victims of floods being diverted to erase the public system and replace it with a private one. We're calling Freedman's plan an educational land grab. I call these orchestrated raids on public sphere in the wake of catastrophic events, combined with the treatment of disaster as exciting marketing opportunities, disaster capitalism. For more than 3 decades, Freeman and his friends had been perfecting this very strategy, waiting for a major crisis, then selling off the pieces of the state to private players while citizens were reeling from shock, then quickly making the reforms permanent. In his most influential essays, Freeman articulated contemporary capitalism's core tactical nostrum. What I've come to understand is the shock doctrine. He observed that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depends on the ideas that are on the ground. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available, and politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. Some people stockpile canned goods and water and prepared for national disasters. Freemanites stockpile free market ideas. And once a crisis is struck, the University of Chicago professor was convinced it was critical to act swiftly to impose rapid, irreversible change before the crisis-racked society slipped back into the tyranny of status quo. He estimated that a new administration has some 6 to 9 months in which to achieve major change. If it does not seize the opportunity to act decisively during that period, it will not have another such opportunity. A variation on Machiavelli's advice that injuries should be inflicted all at once. This proved to be Freeman's most lasting strategic legacy. In Iraq, first came the war designed, according to the authors of Shock and Awe military doctrine, to control the adversary's will, perception, understanding, and literally make an adversary impotent to act. Next came the radical economic shock therapy, imposed by the country while the country was still in flames, by U.S. envoy Bremer. Mass privatization, complete free trade, 15% flat tax, dramatically downsized government. Iraq's interim trade minister said at the time his countrymen were sick and tired of being subjects of experiments. There have been enough shocks to the system. We don't need this shock therapy in the economy. When the Iraqis resisted, they were rounded up, taken to jails where bodies and minds were met with more shocks these ones distinctively less metaphorical. The reader started researching free markets' dependence on the power of shock in 2003, during the early days of the occupation of Iraq. After reporting from Baghdad on Washington's failed attempts to follow shock and awe with shock therapy, she traveled to Sri Lanka and observed the devastating 2004 tsunami and witnessed another version of the same maneuver. Foreign investors and international lenders had teamed up to use the atmosphere of panic to hand the entire beautiful coastline over to entrepreneurs who quickly built large resorts, blocking hundreds of thousands of fishing people from rebuilding their villages near the water. In a cruel twist of fate, nature has presented Sri Lanka with a unique opportunity. And out of the great tragedy will come world-class tourism destination, the Sri Lankan government said. By the time Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and the nexus of Republican politicians, think tanks, land developers started talking about clean sheets and exciting opportunities, it was clear that this was now the preferred method of advancing corporate goals, using moments of collected trauma to engage in radical social and economic engineering. Mike Battles put it best. For us, the fear and disorder offered real promise. The 34-year-old ex-SEAL operative was talking about how the chaos in post-invasion Iraq had helped his unknown and inexperienced private security firm, Custer Battles, to shake roughly $100 million in contracts out of the federal government. His words could serve just as well as the slogan for contemporary capitalism. Fear and disorder are the catalyst for each new leap forward. The three trademark demands of the free market system in Friedman's theory are privatization, government deregulation, and deep cuts to social spending. Tended to be extremely unpopular with citizens, but when the agreements were signed, damn, I can't quit shaking. There was still at least the pretext of mutual consent between governments doing the negotiations, as well as consensus among the supposed experts. Now the same ideological program was being imposed via the most badly coercive means possible, under foreign military occupation, after invasion, or immediately following a cataclysmic natural disaster. September 11th appeared to have provided Washington with the green light to stop asking countries if they wanted a U.S. version of free trade and democracy and to start imposing it with shock and awe military force. As she dug deeper into the history of how the market model had swept the globe, she discovered the idea of exploiting crises and disasters had been the modus operandi of Milton Friedman's movement from the very beginning. Seen through the lens of this doctrine, the past 35 years look very different. Some of the most infamous human rights violations of the era, which have tended to be viewed as sadistic acts carried out by anti-democratic regimes, were in fact either committed with the deliberate intent of terrorizing the public or actively harnessed to prepare the ground for induction of radical free market reforms. In Argentina in the 70s, in Chile in the 70s, in China in '89 after the shock of Tiananmen Square, the Falklands War in '82, NATO attack on Belgrade 1999. The traumatic episodes that have served as softening up purpose have not always been overtly violent. In Latin America and Africa in the 80s, it was the debt crisis that forced countries to privatize or die, as one former International Monetary Fund official put it. Coming unraveled by hyperinflation and too indebted to say no to demands that came bundled with foreign loans, governments accepted shock treatment on the promise that it would save them from deeper disaster. In Asia, the financial crisis of '97-98, almost devastating as the Great Depression, that humbled the so-called Asian tigers, cracking open markets to what the New York Times described as the world's biggest going out of business sale. Quite the opposite. As Freeman understood, the atmosphere of large-scale crisis provided the necessary pretext to overrule the express wishes of voters and to hand the country over to technocrats. All right, shock therapy comes home. Freeman's Chicago school movement, thank you, whoever did that, has been conquering territory around the world since the 70s, but until recently, its vision had never been fully applied to this country. Certainly, Reagan had made headway, but the U.S. retained a welfare system, a social security system, public schools, where parents clung, in Freeman's word, to their irrational attachment to a social system. When Republicans gained control in Congress in 1995, David Frum, a transplanted Canadian and future speechwriter for George Bush, was among the so-called neoconservatives calling for a shock therapy-styled economic revolution in the U.S. Here's how I think we should do it. Instead of cutting incrementally, a little here, a little there, I would say that on a single day this summer, we eliminate 300 programs, each one costing $1 billion or more. Maybe these cuts won't make a big deal of difference, but boy, do they make a point. And you can do them right away. Frum didn't get his homegrown shock therapy at the time largely because there was no domestic crisis to prepare the ground. But in 2001, that changed. When September 11th attacks hit, the White House was packed with Freeman's disciples, including Donald Rumsfeld. Bush team seized the moment of collective vertigo with chilling speed, not as some have claimed because the administration deviously plotted the crisis, but because the key figures of the administration, veterans of the early disaster capitalism experiments in Latin America and Eastern Europe, were part of the movement that praised for crisis the way drought-struck farmers pray for rain, and the way Christian Zionist end-timers pray for the rapture. When the long-awaited disaster strikes, they know instantly that their moment has come. For 3 decades, Freeman and his followers had methodically exploited moments of shock in other countries, foreign equivalents of 9/11, starting with the Pinochet coup on September 11th of '73. What happened on September 11th, 2001 is an ideology hatched in the American universities and fortified Washington institutions finally had its chance to come home. The Bush administration immediately seized upon the fear generated by the attacks, not only to launch the war on terror, but to ensure that it's almost completely for-profit venture, a booming new industry that has breathed new life into the faltering U.S. economy. Best understood as disaster capitalism complex, it has much further reaching tentacles than the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned against, from fighting terrorism to international peacekeeping, municipal policing, responding to increasingly frequent national disasters, privatizing prisons. The ultimate goal for the corporations at the center of the complex is to bring the model of for-profit government, which advances so rapidly in extraordinary circumstances, into the ordinary and day-to-day functioning of the state, in effect, to privatize the government. To kickstart the disaster capitalism complex, the Bush administration outsourced, with no public debate, many of the sensitive and core functions of government, from providing health care to soldiers, to interrogating prisoners, to gathering and data mining the information on all of us. The role of the government in this unending war is not that of an administrator managing a network of contractors, but of a deep-pocketed venture capitalist, both providing the seed money for the complex's creation and becoming the biggest customer for its new services. To cite the 3 statistics that show the scope of this transformation in 2003, the U.S. government handed out 3,512 contracts to companies to perform security functions. In 22 months, ending in August of '06, the Department of Homeland Security had issued 115,000 such contracts. The global Homeland Security industry, economically insignificant before 2001, is now a $200 billion sector. In 2006, the U.S. government spending on Homeland Security averaged $545 per household. And that's just the home front war on terror. The real money is in fighting war abroad. But beyond the weapons contractors who've seen their profits soar thanks to the war in Iraq, maintaining U.S. military is now one of the fastest growing service economies in the world. No two countries that both have a McDonald's has ever fought a war against each other, boldly declared the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman in December of '96. Not only was he proven wrong 2 years later, but thanks to the model for profit warfare, the U.S. Army goes to war with Burger King and Pizza Hut in tow, contracting them to run franchises for soldiers on military bases from Iraq to the mini-city of Guantanamo Bay. Then there's the humanitarian of relief and reconstruction. Pioneered in Iraq, for-profit relief and reconstruction has already become a new global paradigm, regardless of whether the original destruction occurred from a preemptive war, such as Israel's 2006 attack on Lebanon, or a hurricane. With resource scarcity and climate change providing steadily increasing flows of new disasters, responding to emergencies is simply too hot an emerging market to be left to the nonprofits. Why should UNICEF rebuild schools when it can be done by Bechtel, one of the largest engineering firms in the U.S.? Why put displaced people from Mississippi in subsidized empty apartments when they can be housed on Carnival cruise ships? Why deploy UN peacekeepers to Darfur when private security companies like Blackwater are looking for new clients? And that is the post-September 11 difference. Before, wars and disasters provided opportunities for a narrow sector of the economy, the makers of fighter jets or the constructions that build bombed-out bridges. The primary economic role of war, however, was as a means to open new markets that had been sealed off and to generate post-war peacetime booms. Now wars and disaster responses are so fully privatized that they themselves are the new market. There's no need to wait until after the war for the boom. The medium is the message. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you get the general idea of what shock doctrine is all about. More acute term for the system that erases the boundaries between big government and big business is not liberal, conservative, or capitalistic, but it's corporatistic. Its main characteristics are huge transfers of public wealth to private hands, often accompanied by exploiting debt at ever-widening chasm between the dazzling rich and the dispossessed poor, and aggressive nationalism that justifies bottomless spending on security. For those inside the bubble of extreme wealth created by such an arrangement, there can be no more profitable way to organize a society. But because the obvious drawbacks for the vast majority of population left outside the bubble, other features of corporatist state tend to include aggressive surveillance, once again with government and large corporation trading favors and contracts, mass incarcerations, shrinking civil liberties, and often, but not always, torture. Ladies and gentlemen, that's generally the shock doctrine. Corporations, global, international, and local, taking advantage of crises to do, or undo, I should say, what was done post-Roosevelt and the crash of 29 to create a combination of democratic, capitalistic society that has both rules and regulations to moderate it and some social functions like education, etc., to support it. And capitalists in the Milton Friedman theory, the venture capitalists, the free market system crowd have been trying to undo those for years. So basically what they're turning government into is a mechanism for profit. And they do that, as I have just read to you, by Naomi Klein. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pretty good book, and like I say, you can figure out pretty much what it stands for. The balance of the book goes through examples throughout the world over a long period of time as to how it was achieved. Now I think perhaps it'd be a good time to read you a couple of articles most recently to give you some idea of what we're going through now. I'll read from you, GOP Lost in Economic Fantasyland by Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman is an economist. By the way, I'm convinced that economists were created by God because he felt sorry for the weathermen. Reading the transcript of Tuesday's Republican debate on the economy is for anyone who actually been following economic events these past few years like falling down a rabbit hole. Suddenly you find yourself in a fantasy world where nothing looks or behaves the way it does in real life. And since economic policy has to deal with the world we live in, not the fantasy world of the GOP's imagination, the prospect that one of these people may well be our next president is frankly terrifying. In the real world, recent events were devastating refutation of the free market orthodoxy that has ruled American politics the last 3 decades, since Reagan. Above all, the long crusade against financial regulation, the successful effort to unravel the prudential rules established after the Great Depression on the grounds they were unnecessary, ended up demonstrating at immense cost to the nation those rules were necessary after all. But down the rabbit hole, none of that happened. We didn't find ourselves in a crisis because of runaway private lenders like Countrywide Financial. We didn't find ourselves in a crisis because Wall Street pretended that slicing, dicing, and rearranging bad loans could somehow create AAA assets with the handy-dandy payment of the bond rating agencies. We didn't find ourselves in a crisis because shadow banks like Lehman Brothers exploited gaps in the financial regulation to create bank-type threats to the financial system without being subject to bank-type limits on risk-taking. No, the universe of the Republican Party, we found ourselves in a crisis because Representative Barney Frank forced helpless bankers to lend money to the undeserving poor. Okay, I'm exaggerating a bit, but not much. Mr. Frank's name did come up repeatedly as a villain in the crisis, and not just in the context of the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill, which Republicans want to repeal. You have to marvel at his alleged influence given the fact he's a Democrat and the vast bulk of bad loans now afflicting our economy were made while George W. Bush was president and the Republicans control the House in an iron grip. He's their preferred villain all the same. Demonizing of Mr. Frank aside, it's now obvious orthodoxy on the Republican side that government caused the whole problem. So what you need to know is that this orthodoxy has hardened even as the supposed evidence for government as a major villain in the crisis has been discredited. The fact is that government rules didn't force banks to make bad loan decisions. That government-sponsored lenders, while they behaved badly in many ways, accounted for few of the truly high-risk loans that fuel the housing bubble. But that's history. What do the Republicans want to do now? In particular, what they want to do about unemployment. Well, they want to fire Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the federal board, not for doing too little, which is a case one can make, but for doing too much. So they're obviously not proposing any job creation via monetary policy. Incidentally, during Tuesday's debate, Mitt Romney named Harvard's N. Gregory Mankiff as one of his advisors. How many Republicans know that Mr. Mankiff at least used to advocate, correctly in my view, deliberate inflation by the Fed to solve our economic woes? So no monetary relief, what else? Well, the Cheshire cat like Perry, he seems to be fading out a bit by bit, only until the hair remains, claimed implausibly that he could create 1.2 million jobs in the energy sector. Mr. Romney, meanwhile, called for permanent tax cuts. Basically, let's replay the Bush years. And Mr. Kaine, oh, never mind. By the way, has anyone else noticed the disappearance of budget deficits is a major concern for Republicans once they start talking about tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy? It's all pretty funny. But it's also, as I said, terrifying. The Great Recession should have been a huge wake-up call. Nothing like this was supposed to be possible in the modern world. Everyone, and I mean everyone, should be engaged in serious soul-searching, asking how much of what he or she thought was true actually isn't. But the GOP has responded to a crisis by not rethinking its dogma, but by adopting an even cruder version of the same dogma, becoming a caricature of itself. During the debate, the host played a clip of Ronald Reagan calling for increased revenue. Today, no politician hoping to get anywhere in Reagan's party would dare say such a thing. It's a terrible thing when an individual loses his or her grip on reality. But it's much worse when the same thing happens to the whole political party, one that already has the power to block anything the president proposes, and which may soon control the whole government.
See what they think about that. That's what I'm down here for.
Yes, sir.
That's the bottom line.
No, sir. It's part of it. You'll have your chance. This is mine. Thank you. Let me.
Y'all will be wrapping up this discussion in about 2 minutes.
Okay. We'll wrap it up real quick then. I won't read you anymore. Yes, I am. Yeah. Do you know what score is?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's called Made from Scratch. Woody Spuds, Potato Perfection.
Perfect.
Good to go and cater.
Perfect.
Bring me a black t-shirt and I'll,
You'll fix it for me?
yeah, I can fix it up for you.
Thank you. He mentioned SCORE. SCORE is a spinoff of volunteers from the Small Business Administration. They're they're all, like me, gray-headed and old. Some more experienced in business than I am by far, but what they do is they provide for free business advice, the things that are important to start up a business, like your marketing in advance to make sure your product has a market, business plans, financing and how to go about getting financing, and of course marketing your products afterward. But they provide that service free, and they're co-located, I should say, at the Trident Chamber of Commerce off Leeds Avenue. Thank you. Let me talk very briefly. Prestowitz's book talks about the deregulation, the effect of the deregulation of the financial industry, corporations, other things over time. Greenspan, very interestingly in his book, talks about the Bush tax cuts and the Clinton surpluses in 2000. It's very interesting to realize that one of Greenspan, who was a Milton Friedman follower big time, talked in terms of what in the world this country would do with a $500 billion a year surplus, which was contemplated by the Congressional Budget Office as a result of the Clinton era remains in 2000. And Greenspan was asked by the Bush administration what he thought about the Bush tax cuts in 2001, and said that if we do any tax cutting, we should not do all of it, because if we do it all, then in essence we won't be able to address things like Medicare, Social Security, and the deficit. That's a couple things. Let's talk about what we can do. Let's talk about theory. Let's talk about trying to establish a philosophical program / basis, at least for part of what y'all are trying to do. How about tax reform? No depletion or depreciation allowances for corporations, oil companies, et cetera, et cetera. How much money would that generate? No business deduction for any sort of lobbying. No capital gains tax treatment of hedge funds or real estate trusts. If you're an employee, you pay taxes as an employee. You don't get to treat your income as capital gains. Frankly, reinstate all rules and regulations instituted post-30 crash. Banks must be banks only, not insurance companies and stockbrokers. Remove or substantially limit the ability to serve on multiple banks' boards of corporations. Think about it. of the Fortune 500 companies, if you go down and look at the list, I have not, but I'd be willing to bet you that the interrelationships of the members of those boards, which control the salaries, are pretty prevalent. I think, quite frankly, the worst decision, I'm a retired judge, the worst decision I've ever read in my entire life, Citizens United. If you really want to spend some time and you really want to understand what that meant, retired Supreme Court Justice Paul Stevens wrote a 90-page dissent to that decision. But it speaks volumes of the methodology in which the corporations have been able to finance elections. In my opinion, this is no really longer a democracy. There's no such thing as one man, one vote. Money controls, period. And until we can deal with campaign finance reform and the lobbyist effort, it won't change. If you think about it for a second, it's very similar to the way corporations actually run. Remember, a corporation has a president, a CEO, a CFO, a board of directors, and stockholders. We're the stockholders, we're the voters. But we never ask the question, do you want to spend $500 million on lobbying? We don't get that question asked of us. Yeah, we have the right to vote out the board of directors, but how often does that happen on a multi-billion-dollar corporation? So in reality, the decisions made at the corporate level on things like lobbying efforts, on things like those issues addressed in Citizens United, private money against a candidate or for a candidate that never goes through the candidate's program. Those decisions aren't made by the stockholders. Those decisions are made by the corporations for their own purposes. Thank you very much, folks. I've run my mouth long enough, but I thought those are some of the things that y'all might want to adopt and stand for.